Hello and welcome. I'm Terry Burns and welcome to my series on the Great Table of Earth. Hopefully you've seen my introductory video to this series. If not, I'll drop a link in below, but I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here and get started. Of this series, this will be the longest video, so please bear with me here. I want to give you demonstrations of the things that I'm talking about rather than just telling you to solve the blind of multi-lettered squares on the Great Table of Earth, which is the topic of this. Just do this. I want to show you how the application changes lots of different things. Now, the biggest thing that it will change our understanding of, although not the lettering of, will be the Tablet of Union or Black Cross, and that's the subject of the whole next video in the series. I just presented this last weekend at EnochiaCon 2025 in Vancouver, so shout out to anyone that was there. It was wonderful to have so many people who do Enochian magic in the same place. This is also an adaptation of an article that I wrote with my late husband, Alan Moore, a decade and a half ago in the Journal of the Western Mystery Tradition, and I'll drop that in also. So let me go ahead and start this, and I'd like to, of course, dedicate this to him. That's my sweetie, and I couldn't have done any of this without him. So I'd like to think he's still here, kind of helping me out as I um, present some of this material online. Okay, so um, like I said, this is the first of a series, and it's not until the end of this series on the Great Table of Earth that we're going to look at how the Great Table can possibly contain the things that the angels or ETs or whatever we think they are told Dee and Kelley that it contained. But that's what we're building up to. We'll even explore if this is something like the Siddhis in Vedic and yogic traditions that is natural spiritual occurrences that happened and can be focused with practice. And then we'll look at an obvious question. What do you do with this once you have it up and running? There's all kinds of things you can do in particular times where that's particularly helpful, in my humble opinion. After that, I do want to do a couple of things to finish out the series I started more than a year ago on the Monas Hieroglyphica. We got through all the theorems, but I want to look at some about John Dee and ciphering, and I'll use some of the material from Enochian because these grids we're going to look at, to someone who knows nothing about it, look like nothing so much as cipher grids. Um, and then we'll look at some of the other furniture. All of this is focused at starting an online Enochian or help with Enochian for people who aren't in initiatory orders or who want to look at it anyway. That'll happen sometime after the autumnal equinox. Now, if you have seen my class on the Monas Hieroglyphica, which I realize was quite long and esoteric, um, you may remember some of the things there that Dee said about the rectilinear cross in the monad right here. That's going to be key to how we explode these watchtowers out in different directions. And there is a logic behind that that I will now explain. When you are scrying, and it's Kelley scrying, not Dee, but we can also assume Kelley knows the monad, and we can also assume that Dee's energetics are going to affect things. The structures of consciousness in your mind affect what you see. One can posit that that's probably why the Enochian language has so many grammatical similarities to English. That is, grammar itself is a structure of consciousness. Now, there is there are some basic transpositions Dee uses, and I'm just going to tell you one that will be very important in exploding the Great Table into different directions. Because some people have wondered, like, well, why do you do that? Here's why. All right, take the rectilinear cross. And remember, Dee will say, well, there's four right angles. They're here in the middle. And you, to understand what's going on, you have to flip them. Now, that's a certain two-dimensional geometric transformation that's not at all unusual. So this cross, these center right angles flip out and become a square. But the other thing that happens all through the monad, or one of many things, is that then that square flips into a cube. Cubes have six faces, but if we were to look at what is here, you'd only have four faces. So a logical way to arrange things might be above and below. Here's the Great Table of Earth. That's the Black Cross. And These are, of course, Roman letter equivalents of the Enochian letters. So if you are D and you see a grid like this, a logical thing to do would be just what he did in the monad. You have already flipped this out into a square and filled in the grids. Now you flip it into a cube. Well, you have four faces, not six. So there is a logic to then putting them in cardinal directions. In fact, I would posit whoever did that first in the modern era probably had some kind of intuitive understanding of what's going on here. But how you do that directionally is a whole nother question, and in fact, it will be something else we'll explore in this series. Okay, but there is no question if you know the monad well, or if you're D who wrote it, um, or Kelley, who is very clairvoyant, which means he's pretty well able to absorb these thought structures, that you will explode it out in three directions. One way you can do it is what I'm going to talk about with these. These are our Enochian tablets. They're in colors. We tried to have them in flashing colors. What Dee and Kelley do is in black and white, but these approximate the tablets used in some Golden Dawn temples, except the lettering is slightly different. That's what I'm going to talk about here. So usually you would put this air tablet in the east, the water tablet in the west, the fire tablet in the south, the earth tablet north, and then this tablet of union is in the middle. One of the things we want to look at is, where did this tablet of union come from? Like I said, that's the next in this series. So you you have exploded it out in three directions, and in the center, you have a tablet of union. That's not the only way you can do it. I mean, that's the way we do it, but using the same principles here, you can do it in other ways, and I'll show one in the next slide. Now, there are all kinds of other things implicit here. For example, pentagrams. I know the pentagram is one of humanity's oldest symbols, and a beautiful symbol it is. But the modern practice of making certain attributions to pentagram points is not ancient at all. You first see it explicitly, actually, with the original Order of the Golden Dawn. Where did they get it from? Well, probably from Eliphas Levi, and there's a good logic for arguing that too. But you see the same attributions a few hundred years before Levi in these tablets. Now, it becomes a chicken and egg thing, like, are they there or did someone put them there? But look what happens here. This seal that is associated with the air tablet, you can attribute it to spirit. And then right here is air of air, water of air, earth of air, fire of air. The same pentagram attributions. And this structure, as I've talked about in my Modus Hieroglyphicus series, is that is of saying air of water, or water of air, um, earth of air. Those are what in medieval times were called elementatas, that is the first breakdown of an element. Now, since this is the great table of earth, we're already in earth, so this is sort of an elementata of an elementata if you want to get all medieval about it, but we're just going to keep going, and I just want to let you know that there are all kinds of structures in the Great Table of Earth that you can explore if you're interested in. And there are other ways of setting it up. This is from the Museum of Science and Witchcraft. And what this is an adaptation of something that Crowley had in Book 4, if you're familiar with that. So this double cubical altar has the seals of the watchtowers and the watchtowers themselves underneath. Now, these truncated pyramids is a particular way of doing things that I'm not going to talk about. It was a Golden Dawn innovation, but the letters are the same. And what I'm talking about concerning the lettering will affect that also. So this is what we're going to explore in this presentation. We're going to look at what caused the problem of multi-lettered squares to begin with, why the usual solutions are inadequate, and where the simple solution comes from. It comes from a manuscript called Sloan 3191 that was written after Dee's diary breaks off in 1587. Who has solved it? David Allen Hulse is the first to have solved it in writing. Alan and I's teacher, Vincent Bridges, solved it with simply a statement, which I think he derived from Hulse. And another of his students, or two of them, Ivan and David A. Enrico, also solved it and made tablets lettered the way I'm talking about. And of course, so did Alan and I. So we've used it. The Enricos used it. My initiating Hierophant, Bear Galloway, used it. And last year we had the wonderful experience of teaching this, among other things, to students in our Enochian Stellar Alchemy classes. And one person who got really far with it was Jeff Dixon. So I want to give a shout out to Jeff. It's always wonderful when someone you don't even know who's doing the same thing has similar experiences. Like, you're kind of going the right way. Um, I also um, want to, based on that last year, and Alan wanted the chance to share what he knew, knowing that, I don't know, he didn't have that much time. Uh, um, some of the things that we learned from our experience with students in that class is what will inform the class I'm starting sometime after the autumnal equinox. Okay. Doing what I'm talking about here will really affect the sacred geometry and then the energetics of your Enochian temple space if you're a solo practitioner, or if you practice with two or three people independent of some magical order. I assume it would have that same effect on a magical order, but I don't want to speak to that because I don't know. That is, even though I am part of a magical order, they have not adopted these, and I don't know of any that have, so I cannot speak to how this would affect with groups of people going through an initiatory system. I know that for solo and independent practitioners, it makes that toroidal flow in the temple space really kick up, and also the so-called spurious effects people worry about with Enochian just simply never happen to us or to any of the others we know who used this system. Um, Partly there is the idea that if you understand the concept behind a thing, it amps up how something works, but I think there are other reasons as well. More on that later in the series. So there are some related problems that can be addressed at the same time, and that's why I'm making this lengthy first video to set you up for how it addresses those things. I've already talked about the first, why a flat table gets projected into four directions and how the four sides become four faces of a cube. And eventually we're going to see how it becomes what we would now call a hypercube, although that wasn't a word in English in Dee's time. And I will talk about that in this video. It also helps us consider something much more direct about what the so-called governors govern and why some governors are assigned to squares and why some aren't, why some letters are reversed and most aren't. The key to all of this, now Hulse in solving this uses a numeric key. Alan and I did not use a numeric key. What we did was use the habits of mind that I saw from Dee while I was working on understanding the Monas Hieroglyphica, because Nancy Turner and I didn't just translate it. I mean, my working through it was an attempt to understand it and not believing that it couldn't be understood. Fortunately, I was working through a magical system at that time. So again, I think Dee and Kelley's grammatical thought process clearly affected the Enochian, but so did their other habits of mind. And that includes the way that they wrote blinds. So while we usually use Enochian tablets that look like this and are exploded into four directions, we're going to go back in this class and look at Roman letter equivalents just because they're easier for most people to read, and Dee and Kelley used them probably because it was easier for them to read. All right, so this is a corrected Great Table of Earth. But until you get to a certain point of people working with Enochian, you will notice that even very talented practitioners, and here I'm using one that was online at the Magical Review that in that article I put a link for in the first slide Ian Rons gave us permission to use. Even someone as talented as he is still had questions about the lettering of a couple squares. So you can see an X and a P, and here is this capital T, small t. Is it the reversed here? And there are other places like that all through here. You can also see he's got the reverse letters. There's an N that is reversed, an L, and there's some others on here. So that is what we're going to be trying to solve, the problems of multi-lettered squares, because we believe and have experienced that everything else follows resolving this particular blind. Now, if you have used tablets in an initiatory order or just bought tablets off the internet, you may think this problem has already been resolved, but it hasn't been. What happens is that people just kind of give up and think, well, there shouldn't be two letters in that square, so we'll pick this one. And maybe they're guided by where it appears in Dee's diary, but there's the way of resolving this to me has not been a resolution. It's kind of giving up and saying, I don't know, I'll use this one. Now, if you use the chronology in Dee's diary alone, you can't solve this blind. David Hulse demonstrates this in his Western Mysteries in the Enochian section on these pages. And then he has about 20 pages after that where he tables it out and numerically solves the blind himself. So the problem of multi-lettered squares comes from trying to table out the Great Table of Earth using Dee's chronological spiritual diary rather than his Enochian grimoire, which is what I take Sloan 3191 to be. It's clearly written out in very neat handwriting after the point where his diary breaks off. It also comes from only having one idea about what the governors governed. Most people assume that what they govern are places on Earth, and then you get into a whole, to me, sort of side discussion, but it's the major discussion to most people of, well, is Dee's geographic knowledge adequate for him to be mapping parts of this to places in the southern hemisphere? Why is so much more of places around him condensed there? Those are all valid questions. I'm not going to deal with any of them because for the purposes of this, it isn't even relevant. So if you use Dee's diary, his spiritual chronological diary, the solution never becomes clear. Directional attributions don't either, nor is there apparent principle behind why the attributions keep changing. The relationship of the Black Cross to the Tablet of Union, to the watchtowers, and to each other also never becomes clear. So despite this, or to show you a few things about this, I'm going to look at a few things from the chronology, just to remind you of it. All right. Now, this is an advanced class, right? I'm assuming you know who Dee and Kelley are if you're even watching this and you're interested in Enochian magic. So you have some idea of this chronology. But just by way of quick review, in 1584, Edward Kelley starts scrying the first 14 angelic calls. If you know Casaubon's true and faithful relation, this makes up a huge part of that. After he scries these calls, he scries 91 angelic governors, and then the 91 provinces ruled by it are communicated. Now, today, most people will stick with the 91 angelic governors, though some argue there is 92 and others say 93. I'm in that final group. I think there are 93 governors, although I'm only going to talk about, well, I'm not going to talk about all 91 of them, but for the purposes of this, if you think there's 91, that's fine. If you want a 92nd one, you'll see how, and I will just keep the 93rd one to myself until we have a reason to talk about it. Okay, so then summer solstice, 1584, Kelley has his vision of 4 gigantic watchtowers. Now, the contents of the watchtowers, all those letters are usually mapped onto the 4 quadrants of the Great Table of Earth, or vice versa. But at this time, those 4 quadrants hadn't been received. So that happens right after this. 4 12 by 13 grids filled with letters are communicated, and they're made up of the names of the governors in a totally different order with seemingly random capital letters. The random capital letters actually are, for the most part, the first letter of a governor. So that principle is kind of easy to tease out of this. But if you study the sheer complexity of the governors and how they interact with the watchtowers, it's enough to convince anyone who studies it deeply that the material, wherever it came from, can't be a hoax. That is, you could argue that the Seal of Amet, as beautiful as it is, and as much of a condensation of medieval planetary magic as it is, that Kelley could have faked it. If he was a talented magician, maybe he designed it, memorized it. It would have been difficult, but it's possible. Whereas by the time you get to this, it's not possible. It's just, and I won't explore that here, but if you want a good exploration of that, David Hulse does that in all his tabling out after he goes through his own chronology. So the different names on the Great Table come directly from how the table is lettered. That is the Enochian kings and queens and spiral names. All of these come from the letters. So the letters are important. You know, if you were using Hebrew divine names and you spelled El not with Aleph Lamed, but with Aleph Kof, it wouldn't work. Okay, that's one of the premises that you bring to the study of sacred languages in ceremonial magic. So these letters are important. So all the names come from the Great Table, and they depend on the relation of particular letters to one another. Unfortunately, attempts to rectify the table with the angelic governors, which appear on it, but are often not corrected, creates a confusion that most people, including Hulse, thinks that Dee and Kelley never solved. Now, this was our point of disagreement with Hulse, though it's not a huge disagreement. We can solve the problem. He solved the problem. Vincent Bridges solved the problem. But I think Dee and Kelley did too, because Dee is solving this with the same habits of mind that were in the Monas Hieroglyphica, one, and by putting particular keys into his Enochian grimoire, much in the same way that we see him do with the Holy Table. Or blinds like the ones that Clay Holden found around the Seal of Amet. Things we'll also talk about later in this series. So our first step in solving this problem is to go to Kelley's vision of the watchtowers. There it is, has drawn in Casaubon's true and faithful relation. And we're going to speculate about why, since Kelley didn't have a great history of being honest with Dee, why does Dee suddenly accept this vision? Again, it's on the summer solstice 1584 that he has this vision. And you usually map the contents of the watchtower to the four quadrants of the Great Table. So then you get 6 Enochian seniors, and you get on this a king and 5 princes and so on. Well, one reason Dee might have accepted it is he seemed to, in his hieroglyphic monad, first he says that it was divinely inspired. And the real breakthrough into extra dimensionality comes in Theorem 20. I'll put a link to my class on that below. But Kelley's vision corresponds to the exact same part of the book of Revelation as that key Theorem 20 in the Monas Hieroglyphica. And you have to assume that Kelley knew that as well as Dee. I think Kelley was much smarter than people gave him credit for. But certainly, if he's been hanging around Dee, and by now they've been doing this stuff for, he's living with Dee at this time. He knows the Monas Hieroglyphica. Dee would presumably have taught him if he didn't already know it. Now, here's Revelations 4:4. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their hands. So the Latin seniores, which becomes elders, becomes that because that's what it's usually translated as. But you can translate it as seniors. And if you look over here, this is in English, right? And 6 seniors as opposed to 6 elders, but it's the same Latin word. Also notice that this drawing has directional attributions. Now, particularly within charismatic Christianity, You often see this vision presented as a cube, although here it's presented as a sphere. Incidentally, I am not arguing, nor did Alan, that the watchtowers are apocalyptic in the sense that most people think they are, right? But you can think of a certain apocalypsis, which is just the Greek word for unveiling, in being able to perceive things outside of three dimensions and so on. I mean, that's a whole nother discussion, but I'm not an apocalyptic Christian for what it's worth. So, but I think if you focus on the incredible symbolism of something like the Book of Revelation, it's going to affect your thought process. Okay, so if we work through these 1587 drawings or 1587 after, and this is in Sloan 3191, the drawings that precede the invocations to the good angels, we can see how he envisions the watchtowers oriented in space, which is what you get here. This is a drawing Alan made based on Dee's drawing. I'll show you Dee's drawing soon. So let's see here. Terra, Earth, 1, 2, 3, 4. It looks like this is probably the great table of Earth. And so what you have is a cube and a sphere and a sphere. The directions, okay. So Orient is where we get Orient. Now, throughout the blind we're talking about, the only watchtower that will be consistent is East. Oro Iba Aospe, the secret names of God on the Eastern Quadrangle, there is East. But the others don't match. Like if we go to Merides, well, Meridi is Latin for midday or noon. You may know in Dee's personal diary, he will often write that he's meeting people. Even though he's writing in English, he'll write a Meridi. He's meeting someone at noon. But it can also mean what we would call the South if you're living in the Northern Hemisphere, because it's towards the meridian or towards the equator. So in the South here, it seems like Emor Dial Hectiga, we've got the Earth tablet. That's not where you usually put it. Occidens, West, Occidental, and there we have the fire tablets, not where we usually put it. Septentrio, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, that's the 7 stars near the North Pole, so it would mean north. Now, there are interesting comments in, excuse me, in Dee's Spirit Diary, where he is questioning the angels about directions, and they say, well, north and south with respect to your poles. Now, they're in Poland, but I'm sure the angels didn't mean Polish people. Poles of a spinning sphere, which Dee knew about. I mean, there is a long and now fairly discounted line of scholarship that says Dee thought the world was flat, believe me. And I talk about this more in my series on the Monas Hieroglyphica, but Dee knew the world was round. I mean, he's helping the Muscovy Company navigate by the stars. So would he know what the poles of a spinning sphere are? Of course he would. Let's look now at the series of grids that precede this drawing, because that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this class. Kelley's vision of the watchtowers, like I said, refers to the same part of Revelation that you get in Theorem 20 of the hieroglyphic monad. And in the hieroglyphic monad, it creates an implicit hypercube. I talk about that, and I'll drop a link to that class below. Now, what's kind of funny is in the hieroglyphic monad, when that happens, this double cube, that is, in effect, Revelation passing through a sleeping Dee, and he thinks King Maximilian is going to be one of the 24 elders going around Christ, all this stuff. It's itself a blind for what is really going on in terms of mathematics, where Dee claims to have solved the Delian problem or the doubling of the cube. He sort of does that sub rosa while presenting this cube passing through another cube, which is one representation of a hypercube, right? You have hypercubes rotate through their own center. Anyway, using the same transformations from the monas, we would explore the 4 watchtowers as a cube, either one exploded out and you in the middle, or it's your altar and it's facing out. So one of the things you need to know is this will be an imperfect hypercube and an imperfect hypersphere surrounding it. Because what happened through medieval times, actually also in ancient times and in these Renaissance times, is that higher dimensional geometry gets presented as the ether or the divine. So you have someone like Nicholas of Cusa describing God as a sphere whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere, a line kind of cribbed by Aleister Crowley in the early 20th century. So one of the things we would call that today is a hypersphere. And we might say, if you were going to map it out energetically, you might get hyperbolas. Again, Robert Gilbert talks about that kind of thing in his sacred geometry classes. So the Great Table of Earth, when the outside connects to and rotates through the inside, becomes an imperfect hypercube. So back to the problem of chronology. The diaries show developing ideas. They don't show a final product. It breaks off. We don't know what Dee and Kelley did with Enochian after 1587. I mean, are we to believe that Kelley, who never practiced it again, or Dee never practiced it again? No, I don't think that. We see them setting up for a heptagonal working in Prague. We just don't know what it is. In fact, 3191 could even be the grimoire for that. We just don't know. There is the story about, the woman who used the remaining parts of the diary to line pie trays. I don't really believe that. I think it's the time-honored habit of blaming the help for your problems, but that's just my editorial comment. What we do have is another entire manuscript. Again, this is Sloan 3191. The dating of this manuscript isn't certain, but it has to be after 1587 because 1587 is referred to in there. So is 1584. Also, Dee's handwriting in this grimoire is incredibly neat. His handwriting in his spirit diary is just really, really hard to read. He has very sloppy handwriting. But his handwriting in this is as neat as it is in, say, his letter to Queen Elizabeth I. So it says to me that this is something prized to him, and what he is writing in there is important. It isn't just a worksheet, which is how some people have looked at it. So if we solve it from this manuscript, it just becomes a mapping problem. We wind up with multi-lettered squares mapped to Kelley's vision of the watchtower, which renders something multi-dimensional onto what looks like a two-dimensional circle. It appears more often as a two-dimensional grid, but you have to transpose it at least to 3D, and by the time we're done with that, the outside will connect to the inside, and it's the closest of what we would now call 4D. The grids which come in this manuscript just before the circular drawing are going to be our key to this, so let's look at them. Here's one of them. This is the one that actually comes just before that circular drawing. So note what's up here in the corner. I'll blow it up over here. So they must be placed. Dee has a marginal comment like that in the section of his diary where he's talking about the holy table. You have to place them this way, and let's see if they are placed this way. Well, R. Over here should be a T. Nope, that's a B, which is it's a symbol for the Enochian letter Pa. What? That's supposed to be, I guess, down here. And this T, so it's not placed that way. In fact, if you look at it and if you recognize these symbols, you'll see he's keeping the seals in every case that we're going to look at with the watchtower. So here we have east, that's north in our modern usage. Down here is south, and over here is west. So we're going over here east, north, southwest. That doesn't make sense. Or should it be east, west, north, south, if we go by the numbering? That's the way that people have labored over this, trying to figure out the directional attributions and then how to number squares. We don't need to do that, though. We're just going to take this note as saying you need to place it this way, and that's how we're going to place them. Here, here is the same thing from Dee's original manuscript as digitized by the British Library. You can see that there are some stronger outlines around some squares. You may recognize these as containing particular god names. The only ones I'm going to refer to these on the line of spirit or the great names just because they're the ones people know. So Oro, Iba, Alspi. Notice there's a Z there. Relettering this is going to slightly change two of these linear names. All right. Because it's easier to look at the way Klein has written this out in his excellent John Dee's Mystical Records, we're going to look at scans from there instead. So this series starts out with just a blank grid. In here is the book binding, right? So you know that these two squares, you just push them over and you've got one big grid, the black cross in the middle. This is the first one. This is the Raphael recension, or the Reformed tablet from Raphael. And you'll notice that this one is in the order that is usually used now, and it's in the order that the one I just showed you says you should place them, right? R, T, B, D. So what we're doing here is going east, west, north, south. Now, to shift from this, you still have to decide, like, are you going to go around in a circle? Are you going to go polar? But we're going to talk about that part when we get to directional attributions. Okay, this is the next one. Most people can't read this, myself included, unless I attach letters here. So that's what I've done, and I'll get to it. But if you are able to look at this and you know right away which one, like that this is the Eastern Watchtower, darn, you're good. This looks to most people just like electric circuits or computer code or something like that. Here's the one I showed you before. All of a sudden, they're in a different order. All right. And that's the last one in the series. Those are the ones we're going to use to do this, to correct the squares. The basic principle here is going to be the governors, by definition, govern the great table of Earth. So the governors govern the square they're in. They may govern surfaces of the planet Earth, but more importantly, they govern the great table, including the squares upon the great table. So because governors govern the great table, a correction to a governor in Dee's spirit diary will always, always trump a correction to a non-governor letter. So that's it. It's that simple. It's just that the proof of this and the ramifications of it are tedious. But the rule is simple. A governor governs a square. You have a choice between any other letter and the letter of a governor. You pick the letter that is a governor. Now, that won't wind up with something arbitrary. What it will do is solve lots of other blinds, as we'll see. Okay, as the easiest example, there is the problem of Paraon. That's the 65th governor. It's in all reverse capital letters, and there is never a seal for it. In fact, the letters are called adverse letters, and the angels say very strange things to Dee about it. What we're going to see is, once we correct all of this, the outside of the table connects with the inside in part through Paraon. We'll also find some other things that there's another letter on the perimeter that will connect to the Black Cross. And we will have an explanation for why there are some governors that their names seem to be too short. Like there's a governor that seems to be just PA. Well, it'll be part of this. So you may see where we're going to find Paraon before I get to that part of the presentation. There's also some governors that there's a seal for, but the seal doesn't give you the seal, or one that there's a seal for and you never even get the name of the governor. This will resolve all of those things. The principle behind the blinds seems D passing on to anyone trying to figure this out, a teaching technique that is the same way the angels worked with him. That is, when D asks questions that are just not relevant, or which show that he doesn't understand what's going on, he gets garbage answers or he gets told to do something else. At EnochiaCon this year, Aaron Leach gave a great presentation on a section of Dee's diary where Dee and Kelley are questioning the angels about this Danish treasure in England, and they want to know how to find the treasure. And the angels keep telling him, like, no, pay attention to this stuff. Don't worry about that treasure. Well, Dee and Kelley don't do what they're supposed to do, but they don't find the treasure either. Okay, within the Enochian corpus, when Dee doesn't understand something and asks questions, you get bizarre answers until it seems like suddenly he just understands it. That's what is going on with this blind. So let's take the angel. This happens with the holy table too, by the way. I mean, the angels there are saying, well, what are your rules of transposition? And it's like, Dee is like, oh, aha, I know the rules of transposition. He writes a little note in the margins. They do it this way. Um, and some upside down stuff above the holy table. Get to all that later on, but it's really cool. Okay, so let's look at Paraon again. The angels really dwell on this, and they tell Dee that every letter of it is living fire. The N, which is supposed to be reversed, is a vial of destruction. Wow, sounds really apocalyptic, right? Is it going to destroy the whole table? Or I would say it's destroyed until you get the table lettered right. But we notice some other really weird things with Parowan, along with it being living fire and the N, a vial of destruction. There's no seal, and the letters are reversed. Well, think of letters reversed as a dimensional, sort of like Alice falling through the looking glass. Um, in any case, these things the angels are saying kind of says, pay attention. So later, the way Dee presents it will also say, pay attention. He's not going to solve the blind for it, but what we can speculate or intuit is that sometime after this conversation with the angels, he had an aha, like, oh, this is how that works. And he passes that on in 3191. He's going to use the same sort of teaching technique the angels used with him. You have to figure out why this governor is so important, and we will. All right, here's the governors again. This is the list of governors. Let's make this easier and just see the Roman letters that would correspond to all of that. All right, and once we do, we will notice that now these are in the order of east, west, north, south, like the table just before. And all we have to do is place them in this order that he gives us in the following grid. That's the order of the Raphael recension. So we're going to place it in that order. I want to look a little bit closer at some of these governors. We'll start with this one, Varochi, or some people would say Varochi, however you want to say it. So the way that governors work is you get a seal by connecting all of them. That's what those squiggles are. In one of those grids I've shown you, you get VIROL. Oh, OL. You might recognize this name. It's on the Western or Water tablet. MPHRSL Gael. Well, if you correct it, that is going to change slightly because he's got underneath here a C and an H because the governor is Virochi. Now we want to look at the same governor somewhere else in the same manuscript, because in this manuscript, Dee has pages of tabled out governors and their attributes. The only attributes we're going to be interested in is the seal for the purposes of what we're doing here. So there is Barochi. Oh, he's written it out like this, but now he has OL written underneath. This, by the way, is what leads Hulse to say that Dee hasn't made up his mind. There are plenty of other, I think he did. You just have to know that the governors govern the squares and it all fits together. All right. So these are both in Sloan 3191. What we're going to be interested in is just the names of the governors and the seals. So, as I mentioned, Hulse says that these discrepancies between the letters in the table and Dee's habit of writing little letters underneath the big ones creates a dilemma for him. I think it's a blind, not a dilemma. What they show is Dee placing in plain sight the solution to this blind. If you understand that the governors govern the table, you just defer to a governor every time. And if you don't do that, nothing else works. It's a much more complex version of the bit in with the holy table. If you don't transpose letters the right way, you don't get a table lettered the right way. All right. So we're going to return these to the order in the Raphael recension. The sigils that go with each watchtower stay with it when you move it around, and we're going to look at this one final time. Okay, we're going to place them in this order. So these get placed in that order. And if we do that, this is what we get. Now, what does that accomplish? It seems like there's still some problems, right? Like, look, here's this N. That arrow is there because it's supposed to be reversed. I didn't have a font where I could reduce it. This L down here is supposed to be reversed. And you might think, oh, here's a P and an A and an R and an A and so you're starting to see where that governor is, right? But that governor doesn't have any L in it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just pause and see if you can figure it out because you want to have a kind of aha experience yourself here. All right. So we relettered following that. And so you can see down here is that L. Down here is this N. Um, we're doing east, west, north, south, like in the Raphael recension. That's all fine, you might say. But why does that matter? I said it was going to affect things. Well, what are they? So let's see if you can jump to the conclusion before I say it. I've ignored the black cross, but recall that there are most of three governors in that black cross, and they're repeated a few times. No, they're not any of these. These first six ones work the way they're supposed to. Here's the name, here's the seal you get if you connect the letters, and so on. But there are some governors that have no seals. Do you remember what these missing three are? They're pretty important. That's right. They're the words you use to open the veil, usually. Elexarape, komananu, and tabituim. The U I'm putting on there not because there's a U, but because there's a vowel. I'm using sort of old school pronunciation. But these letters are usually used to open the veil. Well, that's pretty important, right? There are two other governors with no apparent seals. Las Dixie and Parawan. There's also a seal for Lax Dizzy. Okay, these are two different governors. Notice this is a Z and that's an X. So there's a seal for this, but it's not listed, which seems, given the care that D writes 3191 in, it seems inconceivable that he just missed it. I don't think he just missed it. And then we have several dots. All right, so let's go to that table again. There's the first one. It has a seal. Second one has a seal. These are also combined when you're doing the ethers to be Lil. That's another whole discussion. Let's jump ahead to Elexarape Komananu Tabituim. There's nothing here. I mean, even if you just had a line, these are all in the black cross, except we're missing an L there. You had a flash? Are you starting to get it? We saw an L somewhere. Also, you remember if you took my class in the Monas Hieroglyphica that D makes much in his famous LVX theorem, which is the only known source of the signs of the adept in esoterica, about L not only being the lineum rectum in a particular mathematic transformation, but being phonetically the same as Aleph Lamed, kind of. So L's are kind of important to him. You have on the holy table these three governors minus the L divided into four. You've taken the class on the hieroglyphic monad, you know all his playing with ternaries and quaternaries. So this ternary changes into a quaternary, which is how you get the light of the cross and other things in the monad. So you see his habits of mind in the structure, but what we don't see are the governors. Here's the one I mentioned, Las Dixie. There's no governor, but it's clearly there, right? This is Las Dixie. Why didn't he put that there? Or the governor that would be like this. That kind of screams, pay attention if you're going through this methodically. and Paroan has nothing there. And there is no place on the Great Table of Earth where they combine. Let's look at these two for a minute, though. This is on what is now called the Water Tablet, the Tablet of the West. Las Dixie, we just saw that, right? But over here is Lax Deasy. That is a governor. He draws it in as a governor, and then he proceeds not to list it. That kind of says, pay attention. I mean, could this be the governor you're supposed to have instead of Pirawan, which he gives no seal for? Or should we slap it at the end and call it 22? You can do either, actually. You can replace this. I mean, which you do depends on a lot of other things that we're not going to talk about here. But this is definitely a governor, and he never lists it. All right, let's move on. So this is our corrected table. And we still have some of these letters that don't connect and aren't in the same document listed as governors. And we have nothing in the Black Cross where we know there are 3 governors, because this is a Black Cross. Exarape, Hekoema, Enaenta, Veitoem. You probably recognize that as the 4 words on the Tablet of Union. One of each of them is associated with a particular watchtower. Why would that be? We'll see in the next in this series. And you can color this in the way some people do so that you're highlighting particular divine names. But let me circle now the governors that are too short to be a governor. And you see, sure enough, Parao on. The reason you don't have a seal for that, you might realize, is you'd have to draw through a 4th direction that you can't connect in 3D, much less 2D. So what this is doing is stitching together the outside of the tablet. And what about this L, which is not part of Parawan? Well, it's connecting the outside to the Black Cross, which he's been told unites the tablet. So El Exarape, Ekoema, etc. Or you can connect it down here, and you see there the names are doubled in the Black Cross. As a cube might be doubled, a double cube being one of the projections of a hypercube into 3D. All right. So the 8 reverse letters, Parawan and L, connect the outside of the Great Table to the 4 quadrants. Now, when we figured this out, not using numbers, but using how does this work energetically and just methodically going through with letters, I mean, I remember, even though it was more than 15 years ago, we were just ecstatic. We were like, that's how it was supposed to be. And it changed even before we charged the tablets. The effect of our energetic space, you could really feel this toroidal flow. So these are the letters that bind everything together. You put the L before here, and here's the Tablet of Union, which, by the way, doesn't exactly appear in Dee's diary. More on that next time. So what is the L in the opening of the veil? El exarape komananu tabitoem. It seems like you're opening the veil to higher dimensions, and that makes energetic sense. The Black Cross binds the Great Table in 4D. The 3 governors that don't have seals, or 3 of them, make up the Black Cross. The Black Cross is often represented as the Tablet of Union. If you use the tabular recensa order, start in the upper left and go clockwise, you get these god names on the meridian. That's what it connects to, but where does the Tablet of Union come from? You only hear about anything like that in Dee's diary one time in 1584. After that, you hear about the Black Cross. So what I'm going to talk about in the next installment in this series is, where does the Tablet of Union come from? And what I will tell you just as a spoiler is that there is no good way to represent 2-dimensionally something that is beyond 3 dimensions. So if you're using the Tablet of Union, don't despair. I'm not going to say, oh, you should never use it. Of course, we use it. But what does it represent? That's what I'll be talking about next time. So hope to see you then. Have a great day. Bye for now.